to the Web3 Prof Podcast.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with Brandon Quittem, who is a VP of Client Success and Operations at Swan Bitcoin. Brandon, thanks so much for being with me here today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So let's get things started. First, Brandon, if you don't mind maybe just giving us a bit of an introduction of how you got into Bitcoin and what your role is at Swan.
Yeah, so like most people, it took me multiple run-ins over multiple years before I actually took this thing serious. As we enter another bull market here, if you're newer and you have these anchors in your mind from a previous price, from a previous year, and you kick yourself for not buying, just accept it. Everyone has the exact same pain. You're not too late. Just march forward. Don't let it eat you up. No one's immune from that pain. How did I get into Bitcoin? 2017, the price was running. Friends of mine were making money trading altcoins and ICOs and all this stuff. And I finally said, okay, fine. I'm not going to sit on the sidelines. I want to make money too. And I think probably my estimation, at least 90% of people initially enter the space to make more dollars. And then after you're lured in by the economic case, some percentage of those people stick around and they find that there's something more to this than simply making money. I was one of those people. So in 2017, traded all the altcoins, made a bunch of money. Early 2018, lost a bunch of money and had to sort of re-understand, what am I doing here? Ask myself hard questions. I went through a crazy 6-month period where I was reading multiple books a week, studying nonstop. Luckily, I was running a business at the time and I could sort of get myself out of the business. So I was just holed up 18 hours a day studying like a crazy person. Out of that experience, which is utter obsession, as deep as I've ever gone, out of that, I realized that I align very much with the values that this system is imbued with.
Right.
And some of those values would be creating a parallel monetary system that puts the power back in the individual's hands. And I think it doesn't mean we shouldn't have governments, but it does mean that we should have symmetry and power between individuals and the state. And I think Bitcoin provides us that opportunity. It's just money on the internet in the same way that we should all be able to access the internet, mobile phones, information. We should also be able to access money. And so I realized during that intensive period that I want to focus my career and my energy towards this thing. Slowly sold off my previous businesses, went all in on Bitcoin, and I did all kinds of nonsense jobs trying to break in the industry. I had a previous career selling enterprise software and got into Bitcoin that year very seriously. And I started writing personally just to sort of learn about this thing and sort of capture my own ideas. And I've been writing online for a while prior for a previous business, so I had a little bit of an understanding of how to pull that off. And I started exploring Bitcoin through biology, which is what I became known for in the Bitcoin space in that era. So looking at Bitcoin as a natural system, most similar to mycelium, which is the primary form of a fungus, which we can talk about or maybe not. You can read all about this online. And then I sold some data products. I had a consulting firm. I built an app, all kinds of stuff. And then I met Corey Clipston, the CEO of Swan, at the Bitcoin conference in San Francisco in 2019. We had a good chat. Later that year, I was out in LA visiting some friends where Corey lives. And we got lunch that day, and I joined Swan as an advisor. And this was before Swan. It was before we had a brokerage firm, we had a company called Give Bitcoin, which was essentially, the thesis was, if I gift my mom some Bitcoin and then the company educates her on what it is, that would be a good way to orange pill people. So you get some, you learn about it, and then let's say after a year, you kind of know what you have and you go on your way. Maybe 6 months after I joined the company, we put pause on that and rebuilt a brokerage service. And what we found is that the people were using our gifting product to create a DCA service. So they were gifting themselves $100 for the Bitcoin a week or whatever it was. And we realized, people just want a way to automatically buy Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And in 2019, that wasn't really possible. And so we sort of leaned in on that. And now I've been there for over 5 years, and now we're a full service financial services firm focused on Bitcoiners. We serve retail and high net worth clients. We have IRA products, so you can buy it in your retirement account. We have a multi-sig vault. We have various other different products and serving corporations or other different things. I started in the marketing side. I oversaw a large part of that org. And then this year I switched over to the revenue and operations side. So I would oversee client-facing teams, both driving revenue, making client experience better, and just sort of working with our financial partners to provide what we believe is the best experience for individual Bitcoiners. And it's been a wild ride. If anyone who's worked in Bitcoin knows, the cycles are brutal. The highs are super high, the lows are super low, and I'm proud of what we built there. And we've taken our lumps over the years, but the future is very bright at Swan, and I'm proud to be there.
That's amazing. That's a great story. 2017 is an iconic year for so many people that I interview on this podcast. I mean, that is also the time when I got in. I unfortunately was late in 2017, and then experienced financial loss following that Christmas. And those are some painful times. But, when we look at years like we're in now, it sure is exciting to be in the Bitcoin space. Your understanding and your contribution to the Bitcoin community based on Bitcoin as a pioneer species is fascinating. So that's kind of what I want to talk about for the first part of this interview, or maybe the whole interview. So can you just give us a bit of a summary of these ideas that you've presented online for those who are unfamiliar?
Yeah, absolutely. So this article, I think I published in 2021, maybe. You can fact check me. I should probably know that. But it was during this environmental FUD situation where I'll say it kind of felt like an immune response from the mainstream media or the institutions in place, where there was this reactionary force attacking Bitcoin for energy use. And it was very loud. It was very frustrating. I was dealing with it with personal friends. It was all over the internet. Bitcoin uses more energy than Argentina or whatever. And I started to get frustrated about that. And I kind of did a deep dive in the energy symbiosis with Bitcoin. So this is really a story about symbiosis between energy producers, grids, distribution, and also Bitcoin miners. And I did what I believe to be a first principles analysis of the incentives that Bitcoin mining provides to the existing energy market. And what I found is that the incentives lead to many positive externalities that were both being missed by mainstream media, but also 180 degrees off of what the mainstream media would say. It's not bad, it's actually good. And many things in Bitcoin I find are counterintuitive in that way, where you first run into it and your belief, your instinct betrays the reality of the situation. And mining is one of them. It feels wasteful. Proof of work feels wasteful. If you're an engineer who likes to optimize things, you would say, why is there so much waste in Bitcoin? Why is it so slow? Why is there so few transactions, et cetera? And then you start to deconstruct Bitcoin and you realize that it's slow and inefficient, quote unquote, for a reason. And that reason is because we copy and paste the database of who owns what Bitcoin across thousands or millions of computers all around the world. And so we give up that efficiency at the base layer of Bitcoin, but what we gain is a resiliency. It makes it very hard to stop. And so bringing it back to mining, I found that looking at ecology was a really effective way to demonstrate the positive externalities of mining. So what is a pioneer species? Let's start with that. So in ecology, there are different types of species that serve different roles. One of those is a pioneer species whose primary function is to colonize a desolate landscape and sort of reboot the ecosystem there. So think a volcano erupts in the middle of the ocean. Now you just have a little igneous rock in the middle of nowhere with no life. Is that igneous rock destined to be a desolate landscape forever? No. The pioneer species, their job is to colonize that. So this could be a seed that a bird travels and poops on a rock. This could be a type of plant that floats and it lands on a new island and attempts to colonize it. Many different examples. I focus on a symbiosis between a plant and a fungus, some type of a lichen, which is a very common symbiosis that performs this function. So the plant and the fungus come together, they land on the rock, The fungus uses chemistry to literally digest the rock and burrows in and creates tubes and tunnels and pumps, kind of like an industrial mining process. And it also has algae attached, which are essentially solar panels creating food from the sun and oxygen. And so those two come together, they colonize that rock, they start breaking down the rock, turn it into topsoil, and that kicks off a process called ecological succession, which is a wave of making the landscape more rich and more biodiverse over time. So think lichen, think tiny shrubs, then you have larger plants, and you have huge plants, and each time you bring in new animals, and ultimately you have a complex ecosystem at the end. And Bitcoin miners are like that first species that come and they find themselves colonizing an energy asset or a desolate landscape with potential energy that's not being harnessed for human use. Bitcoin mining comes in, they work together with the people building out that generation, and they essentially improve the economics of creating that energy asset. And that leads to more energy being produced around the world at a lower cost. And one last point on the pioneer species is that once it becomes a apex ecosystem, that pioneer species is effectively outcompeted by the more complex life that shows up there. So that lichen ultimately is shaded out by the oak tree or whatever. And so what happens then is hopefully that pioneer species reproduces, finds a new area to colonize. And the Bitcoin miners, I want to tie that in because it's relevant to Bitcoin, which is you go bring these miners on site. Let's say you're in a remote hydro area in the Congo, okay? Mountainous, huge potential energy in the form of gravity and water. You go build a dam, you get some energy. However, no one really lives there. So you're producing energy and you have nothing to do with it. So maybe it takes 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years to move that energy to the population centers. In that period, you're just wasting energy, wasting money. And so instead of having that lull period, you hire the Bitcoin miners to come on day one. They just build a little facility right next to your generation, and they buy all energy from day one. And that reduces the cost of funding this facility, reduces the risk. It makes it much easier to launch these facilities. And then once the end user population increases, then all of a sudden the Bitcoin miners can no longer purchase that energy economically, so they leave. And miners are always looking for low cost power. So any retail or industrial consumer will always be willing to pay more. That's important to note. Miners are not taking energy from your home or the hospitals. That would never happen because miners are ruthlessly capitalist. They need low cost power or they don't make money. And so those miners, they drop a shipping container, they seed this initial energy asset, produces a bunch of energy. Then you have, well, if a bunch of energy available, then you might build a industrial plant to manufacture something. If you have a manufacturing plant, you might need a place for people to live, place for people to find food, and all of a sudden you have that same trophic cascade effect happening on human civilization wherever these energy assets spring up. And again, the retail demand comes in, miners go leave, and they go seed another energy asset around the world. So I had this beautiful picture in my mind of miners going and spreading little pockets of prosperity all around the world. And taking one step back, most people don't have a good grasp of what energy or electricity is, how people use it, how important it is. So I'll give some basic principles here. One is that I see energy as the master commodity, meaning if you have cheap energy, you can do whatever you want with it. You can make things, you can take salt out of the water and turn the sea into drinking water. You can have medicine, transportation. Your kid's born prematurely and they need an incubator. You better have reliable, low-cost power to the hospital to achieve that. So it's upstream of all human prosperity. And there's all rich countries consume a ton of energy, and there's no rich countries that don't do that. So we should be thinking about energy use as a very important thing. And if you care about humans, you care about low-cost power. In the US, we pay way less for power than you do in most places in Africa. Okay. And we have more money to pay for it here. However, that's not the case in Africa in many cases. And so, yeah, if you want to spread prosperity, you want to help developing countries, you want to be a humanitarian, make people rich, and you make people rich by giving them cheap power. and the rest happens on their own. And so I really, really do believe that this energy market symbiosis with mining is hugely net positive for the world, especially people on the poverty, on the margin. They're the folks who really benefit from low cost power. Another couple points, and I'll get off my soapbox here. Energy is not globally fungible. And what I mean by that is if you have energy in remote geothermal in Iceland and you're 100 miles from a population center, you can't just sell that to someone in the US who wants to make a widget, right? And so the principles here are that energy does not move very far. It's really expensive to move power around. You have to build really expensive high voltage lines. And even when you have the lines, which take forever to build and they're really expensive, you lose a lot along the way. So just think of energy as geographically isolated generally. The next thing is that storage is really hard and really expensive. So grids are effectively matching supply and demand. So if you produce a lot of energy, someone needs to buy it immediately or it causes problems. And problems cost money. So the grids incentivize people to match supply and demand, which is why different energy contracts, power might be cheap during the day and expensive in the evening when everyone's consuming it. And that also brings up a lot of questions with renewables, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But the net result here is that there's stranded energy or mispriced energy or otherwise wasted energy all over the world. And the Bitcoin miners' role in this whole, if you look at the planet, their role is to go find out these mismatched power prices and connect with them, buy the low cost power as long as it's available. And that makes way more money for energy producers. And we have tons of examples all around the world now where if you have miners associated with a production facility, the energy prices for retail consumers goes down. Company makes more money and they can spread the profits out around the people. And so, yeah, that's enough. That's enough for the opening here.
I mean, that's fascinating. It's cool to hear your explanation and your commentary on how Bitcoin can function in kind of changing the landscape of a society. And it's interesting how you liken Bitcoin miners to this idea of a pioneering species to colonize these harsh environments. It's certainly not a line of thought that we hear often. Can you elaborate on how this analogy reflects Bitcoin's mining adaptability in global energy markets? You commented a little bit about, in the Congo, maybe they have some energy, but they don't have a grid. And what lessons can energy producers learn from Bitcoin's adaptability?
Let's see. I think I want to touch on a company called Gridless a little bit. Are you familiar with Gridless?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Gridless is solving the last mile problem in Africa. It's funded by Jack Dorsey and many other big names. Eric Hirschman runs it, white African on Twitter. He's a legend. He grew up in Africa. I think he was educated in the US, but he's built a ton of massive businesses there and he thinks really big. He did like the broadband or maybe the telco rollout there. He's instrumental in that. Really cool guy. Nonetheless, what happens in Africa is that most of the major cities have some sort of electricity. Usually it's not 24/7. There's some gaps, but you get by. Now, the further you get away from those population centers, the lower percentage of people have electricity. I don't remember the numbers, but it's like pretty much no one off the grid has energy. And the reason is back to those high voltage transmission lines. Super expensive to move that energy out to the middle of nowhere. And when you get out to the middle of nowhere, there's barely any people anyways. So it's not economical. You'll never make your money back. So the end result is no one brings power there. Now, one caveat is NGOs and various non-profit oriented organizations sometimes do something here. But if they were to be effective, then people would have electricity, but the reality is they don't. And so there's really no world where they close the gap. And Bitcoin mining, on the other hand, has an economic incentive to go solve this problem. Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. I think that's a good principle for anything, and it's very true in Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. So Gridless goes and they go set up these microgrids think like a mini dam in a tiny little river in the middle of nowhere, drop 2 shipping containers, one for power, one for machinery, one for mining. And then what happens is the miners from Gridless will buy 100% of the power if needed. Otherwise, the village can consume as much as they want. And having that anchor tenant in the form of mining allows these energy assets to be produced initially, and it's longevity because there's an economic incentive. And so there's amazing success stories all over. We take it for granted in the West, but as simple as charging your phone so that your daughter can learn English or study or call your family, or the absolute most basic things imaginable. That's what you're providing here. And that provides a lot of optimism, a lot of prosperity, and it gives people a chance for their kids to have a better life. So very, very special. Let's see. In terms of lessons, I think the biggest lesson is that we want more energy. Bitcoin supports it. And they do that by co-locating with the energy assets. We kind of touched on this. And so I think anyone who's producing energy right now should think very, very hard about whether or not they should add a miner. I have friends in the nuclear industry that's sort of having a renaissance, or at least the beginning stages of it. They're all thinking about nuclear. If you want to look at renewables, there's no world where we don't have Bitcoin mining attached to solar power, for example.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Why does Bitcoin have a relationship with solar power?
Yeah, Texas is the best example. So West Texas is full of wind and solar resources, meaning it's sunny and windy. However, no one lives there. Population centers in Central Texas, so they have to make transmission lines to bring it to the people. That's the context. ERCOT is the grid. ERCOT's a private grid, so it's slightly different than the other handful of grids in the U.S. And ERCOT's leaning into this. They're a little bit more free market thinking than other places. And what ERCOT finds is that solar has a lot of subsidies, so it's cheap to build these generation facilities. However, the sun shines during the day. So I'm going to introduce something called the duck curve. If you look at the supply and the demand of energy per day, in the morning, everyone wakes up, gets ready, uses a ton of power. And then they all go to work, power consumption, rock bottom midday, and then it ramps up towards the end of the day. People get home from work, call it 5 to 10 p.m. is peak, and then it goes down again. Okay, so remember, you got to match production and consumption. So if you're producing solar midday, no one needs it. Those incremental electrons that you're providing to the grid are worthless. They're actually worth negative money. You're causing pain to the grid by even supplying them. So what ERCOT does is they'll have special energy contracts where they'll pay people to give up their power at peak and buy the power during the trough in the demand. And so if you have an energy solar producer in the middle of nowhere, you can just add the miners immediately and they buy everything unless the grid will consume it at a higher price. Yeah. And that sort of matches the load. Did that get it for you?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's excellent. I appreciate that. And I think that's important for people to understand is that, with solar, the peak hours of the production is not necessarily when you need the peak energy. And as you said, the storage of that energy is very expensive. And so Bitcoin offers a tremendous solution there.
Yeah. And if we go pie in the sky, big picture, what's going to happen to the grid? We currently live in a world where if the peak demand exceeds our supply, let's say in Texas, I think it was in February, they had a really cold week or something like that, like pipes burst and they could not produce enough energy and people died. It was a big deal. In that world, they have what's called peaker plants. And these are supplemental energy production, usually natural gas. And what they do is they say, oh, shoot, we need more energy. Hurry up, fire up the peaker plant. And that thing runs for a week or an hour or whatever is needed to supplement the energy, right? And even with the peaker plants, we planned for it. You have 100-year storm and you're not prepared, so people died, okay? That's not a great system to have supplemental demand that you don't really use. So it's a really uneconomical way. And if you have 100-year storms, you're still screwed. Okay, and that's called a supply response grid. The supply responds to the demand. In a Bitcoin world, you can have a demand response dominant grid, meaning that you overproduce energy. You can 10x the production, and any unused power goes to miners.
Right.
And then the second the consumers need it, the miners just turn off, and all the power flows to the people who need it. So that produces a more resilient grid, and it essentially minimizes our deaths to natural disasters to approaching zero.
And so in a situation where this energy that you're referring to is from sustainable sources like solar or wind, I guess the environmentalist in that situation doesn't really have an argument that it's bad for the environment. We're producing more energy than maybe we need, but it's sustainable energy. We're not maybe burning natural gas or coal power plants to do this, but if we do it in a sustainable way, it effectively stops people from dying during these 100-year storms in these situations.
Yeah, I think one other important principle to land is that there's a difference between baseload power and variable power. So baseload power is always produced. It's independent of the weather. So if it's not sunny, if it's not windy, there's no power. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're burning coal, burning natural gas, you have hydro during rainy season, you have nuclear, that's the majority. Geothermal, if your location offers it. So that's sort of your profile of baseload. This is always on. You need this. If you want to have a hospital, if you want to have any modern things, you want to have heating, power, anything we take for granted, you must have high baseload, always on, always available. And that does require the things I mentioned. You cannot get that from wind and solar. It will never, ever, 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 ever happen unless you want to live in a horse and buggy and, whatever. So what that means is, what do we want to lean into? If you care about the environment, you would say burn fewer thermal sources. So less nat gas, less oil, less coal. Most of the energy, the reduction in carbon production, which that's flawed, but we can skip that for this call. Most of the improvement, let's say, in the US grid from the carbon production standpoint has come from burning more nat gas and less coal over the last 30 years. So that's a huge step. It's about 50% as intensive as coal. That's good. But if you want to keep going all the way, then nuclear is the only option. So it's good to see the environmentalists starting to change their tune on nuclear. I understand it's scary, but it's totally safe. It's great. And it is the only alternative. So embrace it, or we're burning nat gas forever.
Let's talk about Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment as an ecological mechanism. You talk about it as this relationship with predator-prey dynamics in nature. So first, I'd like you to explain the difficulty adjustment, because I do think that's a misunderstood or maybe even an unknown aspect of Bitcoin. And then also, how do you see this principle shaping the resilience of decentralized systems compared to centralized systems?
Yes. Okay, I love this one. So first off, like any good Bitcoiner, anything I read or consume, I see through orange tinted glasses, meaning I just jam my own little pet analogies into things. And sometimes they land and sometimes they help. And other times you're kind of just being a think boy and saying things that don't really matter. You can be the judge on where I fall in that.
Yeah,
spectrum.
I'll let you know.
So, okay, the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin's system, in its architecture, in its original design, you have to figure out a way to release the monetary units into existence. Okay, there's 21 million total. And every 4 years, the supply that's being issued into the market is cut in half. So it decays exponentially. So in the first 4 years, half of the supply was released. In the next 4 years, half of the remaining supply is released. So in that case, 25%, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you ensure that that supply schedule is as programmed, knowing full well that we're going to be better and better at mining? And what I mean by that is the mining game is essentially a lottery. And the system sets a difficulty. How hard is the lottery today? How hard is the lottery in 2 weeks, et cetera? And so what you're trying to do is account for Moore's law and the ability to produce more hashes or more guesses of that lottery ticket as we improve our technology. Mining started on a laptop and then it moved to these industrial facilities, right? So we got 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 more efficient at this. And so if we didn't have the difficulty adjustment, as technology increased, we would mine Bitcoin at a faster rate. We would issue the supply at a faster rate, which would sort of break the incentive mechanism. So this is to ensure supply is issued at a consistent rate, independent of technological advancements and independent of any shocks to the mining system. For example, China banned mining, quote unquote, a few years ago. In that period, about 40% or so of the miners went offline, which would mean it takes 40% longer to win the lottery, which means 40% longer to make a transaction get into the ledger. So in order to move your money, instead of taking 10 minutes or 20 minutes, it would take double that or whatever, right? So that's the whole point of the difficulty adjustment. It's kind of like a thermostat. If the coins are coming out too fast, you turn it down. If the coins are coming out too slow, you turn it up, with a target of transactions being confirmed and new coins minted every 10 minutes. So it's about matching supply of the system. Now, I use a ecological example here that I learned about as a kid in Minnesota. So there's a really cool island on Lake Superior, one of the Great Lakes. And on this island, 100 years ago or something, the lake froze, which is rare. And what happened is moose and wolves walked across the frozen lake, found themselves on this beautiful island. Spring came, ice melted, and now you have moose and wolves stuck on an island.
Okay.
What this looks like is it's kind of the case study for population ecology. You have a predator and a prey in a confined space. You can very easily measure the population of both. You kind of know their food, and there aren't many other animals to mess with the variable. So it's actually a pretty good experiment. And then what they found is they measured the moose and the wolves over time, and they could see, okay, the wolf population gets really big, but then they eat too many moose, and then there's not enough food, and then the wolf population collapses, and then the wolf population collapses, and then the moose are free to roam. Then they get huge, but then they eat all the food, and then they create diseases, right? And you can kind of see these two populations chasing a dynamic equilibrium. I see the mining ecosystem the same way. Moose are the profits. The wolves are the miners or the business. And so, yeah, the wolves want to eat the moose. The businesses want the profit, right? And you kind of just chase that up and down. So let's say we double the amount of miners tomorrow because someone decides they're bullish on Bitcoin and they spend $20 billion and they start mining. Okay, that means that there's a ton of wolves chasing the same amount of moose, which means all the wolves or all the miners make less money per. Okay, then as time goes on, the weakest wolves or the least economically sound miners, they don't get to eat. And so ultimately they go out of business, or those wolves they're culled. So the wolf population comes down to the point where all the wolves can eat, aka all the miners get paid. And so as the market dynamics shift, you're constantly readjusting and the unprofitable people get kicked out. That's what you want to see, right? You need the weak wolves to die so that the herd can survive. And it's the same on the moose side. They want to give up their old and their sick so that the population doesn't explode. They eat all the food, and then erosion and disease and blah, blah. So that's a good thing. It's the same way that businesses work in a healthy economy. And that's where we tie this to Bitcoin. So in a centralized system or a fiat system, they don't let any businesses die. If you remember the GFC, too big to fail banks. So we got to bail out the banks. And what does that mean? It means we're propping up companies that shouldn't live anymore, and everyone around you pays the price. So we're essentially privatizing the gains. So the banks get to keep the money if they make it. But if the banks blow up and they lose money, we socialize the losses. All the people pay for it. That's a really poor system. And the end result is you suppress volatility, you suppress risk, because you're constantly intervening unnaturally into a system. And that just makes the whole system vulnerable and brittle. And what it results in is a larger and larger collapse later. And so deregulation in the 90s and the aughts made way for the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis, we didn't allow that pain to be realized. We bailed them out, and that blew up another bubble now, which is government debt. We forgot about .com led into '08, which led into that. So it's just bubbles all the way down or all the way up. And that's a bad way to run an economy. Okay. Now on the other side, you have a decentralized system. This would be Bitcoin. This would be nature. This would be free markets as they would be on paper, not distorted by governments. And this is defined by creative destruction. So if a company fails for economic reasons, in a healthy environment, the parts there, the machines, the people, the relationships, those should be recycled back into the ecosystem. Those people should go work on more productive things. Those machines should go somewhere where they can be allocated better. That's how you maintain a healthy market. That's how you create prosperity. And from the macro scale, let's say you're driving an economic system and you're the central reserve or the fiat banker du jour. You're trying to manipulate the economy to steer what you want, and that creates unintended consequences. Again, bigger problems, more pain. In a Bitcoin system, you can't hide it. If you don't have the Bitcoin, you don't have the Bitcoin. No one steps in and saves you. No one has a revive the wolf potion to mix it up, right? And that means that volatility is realized in the moment. It also means that volatility is higher in the short term. So price volatility is high in Bitcoin, but you gain systemic stability. So you're not going to have a global financial crisis in Bitcoin because you can't hide the risk. On a fiat system, you get short-term price stability. Yay, we only get deflated at a slow rate, but you also have to accept systemic instability, which means periodically you have these massive boom-bust cycles that create enormous pain and wipe out life savings and et cetera. And so it's a totally different way to look at the market. Bitcoin is more like nature. It's more like an old growth forest. Fiat is more like the industrial agriculture. All it takes is one disease to wipe out all the bananas in the world, which happens from time to time in many cases. And so, yeah, that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that one made sense.
I mean, I like the idea that I can't remember the term that you just used, but there's like this idea of there's stability in fiat currency, but it hits these massive dips and crashes. And Bitcoin is constantly accused of its instability. One thing, I'm in Vancouver, and our mayor has proposed to hold Bitcoin on the city's balance sheet. And one of the arguments, of course, against this is that, well, why would the city hold a volatile asset like that when it should actually just be holding something more stable like dollars? And so I like the analogy that you give there with kind of the old growth forest.
Yeah, which you have some of the few remaining in North America in BC, right?
It's something we're into around here.
It's amazing. Same. One point on that, though, just to knock your leadership over there, is Bitcoin is volatile, 100%, no questions asked. But you solve for volatility with position size, meaning your government shouldn't go 100% Bitcoin to pay their bills next month. Of course not. But could they take 1%, 0.5%, 5%, 10%? Of course they could.
Yeah.
And if you go look at the Wall Street analysis, hey, what assets provide the best returns, right? We've had 15 plus years of Bitcoin now. And all the analysis say you must own Bitcoin if you want to maximize your risk-adjusted returns. Key part being risk-adjusted. You don't take additional risk for those returns. You're actually taking less risk for more gains by adding Bitcoin to your portfolio. Yeah. So even Wall Street recommends taking large positions. So there we go.
I appreciate that. That's really good, Brandon. Okay, so you describe Bitcoin mining for energy solutions, kind of a buyer of the last resort. How do you envision Bitcoin evolving in a future where renewable energy dominates the landscape?
Yeah, so two principles here: buyer of first resort, buyer of last resort. Let's nail that, and then we can talk about the renewables. So the Pioneer Species essay is all about the buyer of first resort. That was sort of the newer angle that I was trying to introduce, meaning if you're going to create an energy asset, Bitcoin miners should be there with you from day one to buy all your power the second you produce it, because there's generally a lag before the consumers are buying it all, right? Buyer of last resort is when you have, let's say you have a geothermal energy asset in Iceland and you're smelting aluminum there, okay? And on a yearly basis, you consume 80% of the power produced, and you don't need any more, and no one else is around. So 20% of the power is totally wasted. Why not plug in some miners and monetize that remaining 20%? So that's the last resort, pioneer species first resort. I think if renewables dominate in the future, and I think that's a very big if, I think we should throw wind in the garbage. I think solar has its place. I think we should go all in on nuclear. But if we do go with renewables, then I think the symbiosis, as we mentioned earlier, is the best way to bootstrap this. Now, caveat, if we 100x our battery technology, there's a world where we can store it and use it, and all of a sudden we don't need as much miners.
Yeah.
But I think for the foreseeable future, miners is the way to bootstrap solar. And we can also get rid of the government subsidies, which create an overproduction of this solar to begin with, which again puts a cost on the grid. Yeah. So the symbiosis is you pair solar and Bitcoin mining. Every single deployment should have a pair. And I think that that's economical, and you don't need subsidies to do it, and you end up with the same result.
Okay, that's great. Maybe the last thing I'd want to look at here is kind of this continued argument against Bitcoin, as environmental critics constantly raising this idea that Bitcoin's energy consumption is harmful to the environment. Now, you've woven kind of this tapestry of commentary, producing evidence that that's simply not a problem. But if you're asked by someone who has environmental concerns, like how do you reconcile Bitcoin's energy consumption with environmental concerns? How do you speak to critics against Bitcoin who are raising these issues, even if they're raising them from the perspective of, or from the point of, I guess, FUD or lack of education around Bitcoin?
Yeah. So a couple of points here. We can just throw out the bad faith actors. No point in talking to them about this. The good faith actors, I think, are the vast majority of people who say things like Bitcoin mining's bad because it uses too much energy. The people who say these things, I genuinely believe they're trying their best. They believe what they're saying. They care about the environment. The reality is that they're misinformed on the fundamentals of the topic. And I know this very strongly because I've had the conversation a million times, and I was that person for my whole life until 4 years ago or whatever, 5 years ago, whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I know exactly what it's like to believe that. And I know exactly how complicated energy markets are, energy grids, energy production. It's so complicated. I'm an absolute neophyte compared to someone who works at ERCOT and manages the grid or something like that. But I think I have a skill set to translate their techno, very complex things into easy to understand things. And so the primary gap is they don't understand the market. And we covered a lot of the things that help in the beginning. I always try to do the principles, like it's not globally fungible. You have to match supply and demand, base load versus supplemental load, duck curve. That's kind of like the basic curriculum, I think, before you can even rationalize this question. And then you can say, how do we get to this point, and where's the FUD coming from? Most of it was coming from the likes of the New York Times or Greenpeace International or various other orgs. If you go even deeper, they're all citing a handful of studies, and studies in quotation. I'm not even going to name these things. They don't deserve to be named. But one of them was 5 students wrote a 2 or 3 pager as a grad students wrote a 2 or 3 pager that was totally faulty from the very second it was published.
It was from the University of Hawaii, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I try not to give them any press, but yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. That and others who will not be named seeded it's really, I would call it like science laundering or science journal laundering. It's just lies. And then they get recycled and they get cited and blah, blah. And journalists, orgs are gutted. They don't have time to fact check. They're confirming their own biases. They're not innocent, but they're peddling the FUD too. And then it gets broadcasted throughout mainstream media. And then normal people see headlines and they say Bitcoin uses more energy than Argentina. And you go, well, that sounds bad. Remember in the beginning, Bitcoin's not intuitive. So it genuinely sounds bad. That should cause an alarm for most people. But then you say, well, wait a minute, is that a lot? Is that even a relative statement? That's like saying, I forgot the famous correlation, but it's like the sun. No, I'm not even going to mention it, but it's variables that aren't related. There's no knowledge to be gleaned on the magnitude of Bitcoin's energy consumption. And so essentially people run into a dead end and their priors get confirmed, but it's the blind leading the blind everywhere you look. I think there's also a slightly more cynical take, is that a lot of people I see have something like a neo-Malthusian fear going on. And that story is, Malthus was an economist from a few hundred years ago. He looked at ecology and he said, wait a minute, if we keep seeing the human population grow faster than the rate we can produce food, then ultimately we're going to exceed our carrying capacity as a species and we're going to all die. And he was doing that modeling animals in a certain way. However, what Malthus is totally wrong. We should not take any of this. What Malthus didn't see was that we use technology to increase our carrying capacity, meaning we get better at farming food. We find low-cost ways to find more energy. Again, makes food cheaper. And so we use technology to expand our carrying capacity. So we should not assume that humans are bad, energy is bad. That's total nonsense. We should throw it all in the garbage. It's pessimistic. It's wrong. It doesn't serve us. The reality is that humans produce ideas. Good ideas are how we increase carrying capacity. We want more people. We want more ideas. We want better technology. You don't go backwards in any of this stuff unless you want to throw away your modern quality of life, in which case I would say you first. And no one ever takes you up on that one.
Right,
So
yes.
I think there's some embedded wisdom here. We're going forward. We have to be smart about it. We have to be smart about the technology we choose. But the way forward is through, not going backwards. And I think as a group, we need to all accept that and move forward. I know young people have like a diagnosable climate anxiety. This makes me very sad. It's based on faulty premises. And you can't have young people that aren't optimistic. Young people should be so bullish on life and so optimistic and ideological to a fault. That's how you have a healthy society. Young people need to go try to change the world and realize it's harder than they thought. And then they sort of get merged into the society, and the older people are kind of the conservatives. We already tried that. But you want that tension of progress and conservation. That's how you have a healthy society. And so it deeply saddens me when I see young people who in many ways are right. They're like, hey, the boomers, they leveraged our future. We can't get in the economic game. They broke the planet. But all they have to do is dollar cost average Bitcoin, and they'll outcompete the boomers by the time they need to. So, there's the white pill for the day.
I like how you started this this episode just talking about how when you got into Bitcoin, it seemed expensive and you thought you missed the opportunity, and kind of battled the same exact challenge that everybody has when they first get into Bitcoin. It's like, am I late? And over the last 5 or 6 years, you've kind of been through the market turbulence, whether that's kind of the social turbulence of Bitcoin's bad for the environment and Bitcoin is used to help terrorism or criminals, or whether that's the price variation that you deal with. But at the end of the day, and as you stick with it, you see like, oh, wow, it seemed expensive when it was $8,000 and now it's $102,000. So maybe $8,000 wasn't that expensive, but it just takes some time and some patience, eh?
Yeah, very, very important point. Everyone believes that 100K sounds too high. Like, how am I supposed to do this thing? I missed it. It's so natural.
Yeah.
But also paradigm shifts are hard. Humans have a really, really hard time grappling with these things.
Yeah.
The technology S curve, right? New technology starts out really slow adoption, then all of a sudden hits a tipping point, and then everyone adopts it immediately, and then it levels off. That tipping point period is a function of us as a social species. I believe it comes all the way back from evolutionary biology, where most of our biology, our DNA, our hopes, wishes, dreams, desire, that was all forged in a time when we lived in small kin groups, maximum 100, 150. In that environment, the worst possible outcome is ostracization. If they kick you out of the tribe, that's gene death. Our bodies built emotional processes to make us feel the pain and avoid being ostracized. So what does that mean in modernity? It means that we have Paleolithic man emotions saying, don't get kicked out of the tribe, fit in, don't rock the boat. We have infinity idioms to describe the same process. We all know what it feels like to not get invited to the birthday party or the Sailor 100K party or whatever the thing is. And so we have to recognize that that is how humans work. We are herd animals by design. And so what that means is we see Bitcoin and it has a high social cost to adopt it in the beginning because your friends aren't interested in it. So that means it rewards people who are comfortable leaving the herd, which is a unique personality type, various different ones. And most early Bitcoiners are like that. Most early adopters of anything are like that. And so what we're seeing now is we're rapidly climbing the S curve as far as I can tell. It's becoming normalized to buy Bitcoin. And when the social cost goes down, so do the future economic gains because everyone's already in the trade. That being said, Bitcoin, we're still very early on this S curve because I forgot the number, but it's like 1% to 2% of people own Bitcoin around the world, maybe even less than that. And so if money is a pretty popular good, I think Bitcoin goes to 100 trillion if it continues, and we're at like 2 trillion now. Maybe that takes 5 years, maybe that takes 50 years. But the future gains are still very large, so you are not late. And I think for new adopters, or maybe you own a little, should I buy some more? The important thing to realize now is that the risk has gone way down. So yeah, 10 years ago, there's more upside. In hindsight, it's our friend. It's easy to say, hard to do. But 10 years ago, you would have been scared out of your mind to buy it, let alone hold it. No one you knew wanted it. No one you thought it was a good idea. You've been called an idiot the whole time. And so you probably wouldn't have bought it. But now the US government's thumbs up. Corporations are scrambling to own it. So it's effective. The large risks are behind us, which means looking forward, it's a way safer investment. The odds of it going to zero are very low now, and the odds of it going up a lot are still very high. So yeah, everyone on this who's listening should own some. Should it be 1% of your net worth? Should it be 100% of your net worth? That's up for you to decide, but 0% is the wrong answer.
That's great. I love that, Brandon. Brandon, where can we find out more about you and some of the things that you've published?
Yes. BrandonQuittem.com is where my essays go. Just my name. I'm most active on Twitter. You can find all my content there as well. My DMs are open. Say hi if you're into any of this stuff, if you have more questions. And if you want to get started at swan.com. Let's see, we're focused on the US right now. We have served international clients in the past, but we're kind of doubling down on the US going forward. We talked about in the beginning, but all different account types, servicing different types of people. We really lean into service. We're your Bitcoin partners. We're thinking long-term, your family's wealth, your wealth, etc. And so if you want like a bespoke niche financial services firm for Bitcoin, check out swan.com. And that's about it for me. Appreciate the time.
Brandon, it's great to be with you here today. I really appreciate it. This has been super educational and helpful. Thanks for being with me.
Hey, thank you. Have a good one.
Okay, bye.